Imagine a cold so profound it steals the breath from your lungs. A world not of green and growth, but of endless white and piercing blue, where the very air is a blade and the sun a distant feeble memory. This was Europe, 45,000 years ago, and into this frozen realm stepped our ancestors, not as doomed interlopers, but as conquerors. Their secret weapon, not a sharper spearhead, but a simple revolutionary act. They learned to sew. This is the story of how a needle and thread forged humanity's destiny. If you are captivated by the tales of how our ancestors shaped the world, remember to subscribe to our channel, Historical Truth, where we unravel the past, one story at a time. Now, let us journey back to the dawn of a winter that lasted for millennia. The wind was a living thing. It did not whisper or howl. It screamed. It ripped across the treeless steppe, a torrent of ice crystals that scoured the earth raw and painted the world in a monochrome of white and grim gray. Lek, crouched in the lee of a mammoth bone windbreak, felt the cold as a physical weight, a great, hungry beast trying to crush the life from his chest. His people, the ones who would later be called Cro-Magnon, were newcomers to this land. They had followed the migrating herds south from the central plains, seeking new hunting grounds, but had walked instead into the jaws of a glacial maximum. He pulled his simple, uncured wolf pelt tighter. It was stiff with frozen sweat and condensation, and the wind found 1,000 tiny gaps to exploit, needling his skin with a cold that felt like fire. He watched his breath plume in the dim light of the snow haze, each exhalation a small, warm ghost fleeing his body. They had fire, yes, and they had shelters of hide stretched over a lattice of wood. But the world outside was a killer. To hunt, to travel, to simply exist for more than a few moments in the open was a gamble with death. Lek's gaze fell upon his mate, Anka, who was huddling with their infant son, wrapped in a similar inadequate pelt. The baby's face was pale, his tiny body shivering uncontrollably. A deep, primal fear, colder than the wind, gripped Lek's heart. They were strong. They had fine flint tools, complex language to plan their hunts, and art that bloomed in the darkness of their caves. But none of that mattered if they could not keep the cold at bay. The great shaggy mammoths and woolly rhinos that roamed this desolate landscape were clad in layers of dense fur, a natural armor they lacked. They had to become like the beasts they hunted. They had to wear the winter itself. The old ways of simply wrapping or tying a hide were failing. The hides were bulky, restrictive, and left vital areas, the torso, the arms, the legs, exposed. They needed something more, something fitted, something sealed. The answer came not in a flash of inspiration, but from slow, desperate observation and the patient work of hands. Anka was the artist with the delicate touch. While Lek and the other men flaked flint for spear points, she worked with scrapers, patiently cleaning and softening hides, stretching them, working animal fats into the skin to make them pliable. She watched how the hides, when cut, had edges, and she remembered how, once she had seen a hunter use a sharp, awl-like tool to pierce a hole in a leather strap. One evening, in the flickering orange light of the hearth deep within their limestone cave, Anka presented her idea. She had taken a small, leftover piece of reindeer hide. Using a fine, sharp awl made from a splinter of antler, she had pierced a series of small, neat holes along its edge. Then, from a length of dried sinew, the tough, fibrous tendon from a deer's back, she had threaded it through the holes, pulling the edges together. The result was crude, a simple seam, but it was strong. It was closed. It was a barrier. Lek stared at it, his mind, so adept at visualizing the trajectory of a spear, now grappling with a new concept. He ran his finger along the seam. It was not just a join, it was a creation. It turned a flat, shapeless skin into a potential container, a potential shell. He looked at Anka, and in her eyes, he saw the same spark of understanding. This was not just about mending. This was about building a second skin. The next day, the entire band's energy shifted. The hunt was still paramount, but now the processing of the kill took on a new, sacred significance. Every scrap of hide was precious. Sinew was no longer discarded, but carefully harvested and dried. The finest, slimmest slivers of bone and antler were sought out to be polished into needles, their eyes painstakingly bored with tiny flint drills. The women, the masters of this new craft, gathered together, their fingers flying. They were no longer just preparing skins. They were architects of survival. They began to experiment. They traced outlines on hides with charcoal, not the shapes of animals, but the shapes of their own bodies, the shape of a torso, the shape of a leg, the shape of a foot. They were mapping themselves onto the hides, creating patterns. They learned to cut the hides into these new strange shapes, and then, with their sinew thread and bone needles, they began to sew them back together. They were not just wrapping themselves in fur, they were building clothes. The first garment was a revelation. It was for little Orvo, Anka's brother, a boy of 10 winters whose slender frame suffered most from the cold. Anka and the other women had worked for 2 days on it. It was not a simple cloak, but a tunic. They had sewn 2 larger pieces of fox fur together at the shoulders and sides, leaving holes for the head and arms. It was clumsy, the seams a little crooked, but when Orvo put it on, the effect was immediate. The hide hung from his shoulders, enclosing his torso in an unbroken layer of warmth. There were no gaps for the wind to slither through. He moved his arms. Experimentally, the freedom of movement was astounding compared to the constricting wrap of a large pelt. "It is like a second skin," Lek murmured, his voice full of awe. He placed a hand on Orvo's chest, feeling the trapped warmth radiating through the fur. The boy's shivering had stopped. His cheeks, previously pale, were flushed with a healthy pink. He grinned, a flash of white in the dim cave, and did a little jig, the tunic swaying with him. This success ignited a fever of creativity. The cave, usually a place of shadows and stark survival, hummed with a new, vibrant energy. The soft glow of fat-burning lamps illuminated huddled groups of women, their heads bent over their work, their conversations a low, focused murmur. They were no longer just processing, they were engineering. They discovered that different hides had different properties. Reindeer skin was tough and durable, perfect for the soles of footwear. Softer fox and wolf pelts were ideal for the body, their dense underfur trapping a thick layer of insulating air. They learned to sew the fur facing inwards, towards the body for maximum warmth, or outwards to shed snow. They began to create layers, a close-fitting inner shirt of soft hare skin. Its fur, incredibly dense, could be worn under the sturdier outer tunic. The concept of the parka was born, a larger hooded-over tunic that could be cinched at the waist with a leather thong, creating a warm, microclimate around the body. The men, initially focused on the hunt, soon saw the profound value in this new craft. They began to bring back not just the prime cuts of meat and the large hides, but also the smaller animals they had once ignored, the Arctic hares, the foxes, the wolverines, whose fur was reputed to be frost-resistant. The very act of hunting transformed. Every creature now held a potential piece of the puzzle for survival. A hunter would return and present a bundle of fine sinew or a perfect straight leg bone from a swan to the seamstresses, with the same pride he once reserved for presenting a massive haunch of mammoth meat. Lek himself became a student. He sat with Anka for hours, his large, calloused hands, so adept at hefting a heavy spear, now struggling with the delicate task of threading a needle. He wanted to understand. He needed to feel the magic in his own fingers. Under Anka's patient guidance, he learned to push the sharp point of the bone needle through the tough hide, to pull the sinew through until the seam grew, strong and tight. It was a meditative act, a ritual of creation that stood in stark contrast to the violent, explosive act of the hunt. As he sewed, he thought of the wind screaming outside, and he imagined his stitches forming a wall against it, a tiny, thread-by-thread defiance of the ice. One evening, Anka presented him with his completed set of new clothes. There was a long-sleeved tunic of reindeer fur, trousers that were sewn together along the inner leg, revolutionary design that allowed for freer movement than the old loincloth and leg wrap combination, and most astonishing of all, footwear. They were not simple hide wraps, but constructed boots. She had made a sturdy sole of thick hairless hide, and then sewn a soft upper of marten fur to it, creating a sealed, insulated container for the foot. She had even stuffed dried grass inside as an additional insulating layer. Lek put them on. The feeling was indescribable. The trousers moved with him, the tunic sat snugly on his shoulders, and the boots. The boots were a miracle. His feet, perpetually cold and often numb, were suddenly, blissfully warm. He felt invincible. He looked at Anka, and words failed him. This was more than clothing. It was a tool as powerful as any spear. It was a key that would unlock the frozen world. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "we hunt the mammoth in the high valley." It was a place they had avoided for months, a wind-scoured death trap. The others looked at him, and for the first time, there was no fear in their eyes, only a hard, bright glint of anticipation. They were no longer just surviving the ice. They were preparing to master it. The Mammoth Trail was a scar of churned snow and frozen dung leading up into the high valley, a place the people called the Wind's Maw. Before the sowing, it was a name spoken in a whisper, a place of legend where the White Death dwelt. Today, Lek led the hunting party towards it with a steady, confident stride. The difference was not just in their morale, but in their very bodies. The brutal, soul-sapping cold that had once been their primary enemy was now a manageable nuisance. Lek moved at the head of the column, his new clothes a flexible second skin. His reindeer fur trousers didn't bunch or chafe, allowing him to navigate the deep snow with a powerful, efficient gait. His parka, hood drawn tight around his face, muffled the screaming wind to a dull roar. Inside his boots, his toes flexed, warm and dry. He could feel the individual muscles in his legs and back working in harmony, his energy conserved for the hunt, not wasted on a futile battle against hypothermia. He glanced back at his companions. Their faces, framed by fur hoods, were set in masks of determination, not the pinched, pained expressions of men slowly freezing. Their breath plumed, but their bodies were reservoirs of heat, carefully sealed in by sinew and hide. The strategy for the hunt had evolved with their new capabilities. Before, a mammoth hunt was a desperate close-quarters affair, a chaotic storm of noise and terror in the lowlands where the great beasts were sometimes cornered against cliffs or bogs. The cold limited their range and their patience. Now they could plan, they could stalk, they could use the very environment that had once been their prison as a weapon. The Wind's Maw was a natural funnel, its sides too steep for a mammoth to easily climb, and its exit, blocked by a treacherous ice field. They would not need to get dangerously close. They just needed to drive the herd up there and let the terrain and the cold do the work. They reached the head of the valley by midday, their bodies still warm, their fingers still nimble inside their fur mittens. The mammoth herd was below them, a small group of shaggy titans, their great heads swaying as they used their tusks to clear the snow and reach the frozen grass beneath. The lead bull was a colossal old male, a walking mountain of muscle and hair, his tusks curved like great ivory scimitars. The sight sent the familiar thrill of the hunt through Lek's veins, but it was a clean, focused thrill, untainted by the fear of freezing. The plan was set in motion. Two groups of hunters broke off, flanking the herd at a distance, using the terrain for cover. Their new mobility was a tactical advantage they had never before possessed. They moved like ghosts through the snow-laden firs, their silent, fluid movements a stark contrast to the lumbering beasts. On Lek's signal, a shower of stones and a chorus of piercing cries erupted from the flanks. The mammoths started, their trunks rising to test the air. Confused and alarmed by the unseen threat from multiple directions, they did what was instinctive. They sought escape by moving upwind, away from the noise. The hunters herded them, expertly applying pressure, guiding the panicked animals directly into the mouth of the high valley. The chase was on. The ground trembled as the mammoths crashed forward, their great weight punching through the snow crust. Lake and his core group of spear throwers followed, their breathing steady, their bodies cocooned in warmth. They were not exhausted, not yet. They could maintain this pace. They were the predators, and for the first time, they held every advantage. The mammoths, driven by blind panic, pushed deeper into the trap. The valley narrowed, the ground rising steeply. The great lead bull, sensing the dead end, trumpeted in fury and frustration, the sound echoing off the icy walls. He turned, preparing to charge the tormentors at his heels. This was the moment. This was why they had come. Lek stood his ground, his feet planted firmly in the snow, his body warm and supple inside his furs. He hefted his spear, its fine flint point glinting in the pale light. His arm drew back, every muscle cooperating, his mind clear, his aim unclouded by the desperate need to simply get warm. He saw the path, the arc, the spot just behind the bull's massive shoulder. He breathed out, a calm plume in the frigid air, and let the spear fly. It was not a throw of desperation, but of precision. It was the throw of a conqueror. The spear was a blur of wood and stone, a silent promise of death arcing through the frozen air. It struck true, sinking deep into the mammoth's shoulder with a wet, sickening thud that was louder than the wind. The great bull bellowed, a sound of pure, outraged agony that shook the very ice on the cliffs. He staggered, his charge broken before it began. More spears followed from the other hunters, finding their marks in his flank and neck. The hunt was no longer a matter of if, but when. The end was not quick, but it was inevitable. The mammoth, weakened by blood loss and harried by the relentless, warmly clad hunters, was driven onto the ice field at the valley's head. His massive weight, a virtue on solid ground, became his doom. The ice, deceptively thick, cracked under the concentrated pressure. With a final, trumpeting shriek of despair, the bull crashed through, his legs trapped in the frozen grip of a concealed crevasse. He was imprisoned by the very element he was born to endure. The hunters closed in, a ring of fur-clad figures around the struggling titan. There was no celebration, not yet. There was only a profound, respectful silence, broken by the mammoth's labored breaths and the groan of the ice. This was a sacred transaction. The beast had given its life so they might live. Lek approached, his own breath held. He placed a hand on the coarse, wiry hair of the mammoth's flank, feeling the immense, fading warmth beneath. He murmured the words of passage, thanking the spirit of the animal for its strength, promising its body would not be wasted. Then the work began. The labor that followed was brutal, a messy, steaming testament to survival. Flint knives sawed through thick hide. Heavy stone cleavers smashed bone to access the rich, dark meat within. But for the first time in such a high-altitude hunt, the cold was not an active participant in the butchery. The hunters' hands, protected by their mittens, remained agile. Their bodies, sealed in their tailored clothes, stayed warm and strong, allowing them to work with an efficiency that was previously unimaginable. They could process the colossal carcass here, on the spot, without the desperate need to retreat to the cave and warmth. As they worked, Lek looked at his people. Their faces were smeared with blood and sweat, but their eyes were bright, their movements purposeful and coordinated. They were not just surviving, they were thriving. They were dominating a landscape that had been designed to kill them. The tailored clothes had done more than keep them warm. They had reshaped their relationship with the world. They had granted them time, energy, and the power of precision. This mammoth was not just food, it was a mountain of resources. Its hide would become more parkas and tents, its sinew more thread, its long bones and tusks raw material for tools and art. The conquest was complete. Weeks later, the memory of the Wind's Maw hunt had settled into the tribe's lore, becoming a new story told around the fire. But the revolution was not just in their stories, it was etched into their very existence. The cave was now a different place. It was warmer, for a start, the hides on the floor and walls sealing out the damp and cold. But more than that, it was a hub of burgeoning culture, all catalyzed by the simple, profound act of sewing. With their basic survival assured, with the gnawing, constant anxiety of the cold pushed back, a new space opened in their minds. The long, dark evenings were no longer just about huddling for warmth and conserving energy. They became times for creation, for expression. Anka, her hands now skilled with the needle, began to experiment with more than just function. Using a sharp burin and a mixture of ochre, charcoal, and animal fat, she started to trace patterns on the new clothing. She painted a running horse on the shoulder of Lek's parka, its legs outstretched in a symbol of speed and freedom. On a child's tunic, she stitched tiny ivory beads carved from mammoth tusk in the pattern of the starry sky. This was the birth of fashion, of identity. Clothing was no longer just a barrier against the elements. It was a canvas. It told stories of great hunts. It displayed skill. It denoted status. The best seamstresses, the ones who could create the most supple hides or the most intricate designs, were revered. Their knowledge was a treasure as vital as the location of the best flint deposits. And the art did not stop at clothing. The same fine tools used to bore needle eyes and carve awls were put to new purposes. In the flickering firelight, an old man named Gore, his body too frail for the hunt, found his calling. He took a piece of smooth, flat mammoth tusk and began to scratch it with a flint point. Slowly, painstakingly, the image of the great bull mammoth from the high valley emerged, its tusks curved, its body powerful, trapped in the ice. It was a record, a memory made permanent. The tailored clothes had not just conquered the icy Europe outside the cave, they had unlocked the vast, fertile landscape of the human imagination within. The deep winter, the great white silence, as the elders called it, had truly settled in. A blizzard had raged for 5 days, sealing the mouth of the cave with a dense, impassable wall of snow. In the past, such an entombment would have been a time of terror. It meant being trapped with dwindling food supplies, the air growing thick and stale, and the cold, once kept at bay by the cave's depth, beginning to seep back in as body heat and fire struggled against the immense insulation of the snow. It was a time when the weak, the very old, and the very young would often slip away, not from starvation, but from the cold, slow, patient kiss. This time, it was different. The cave, lit by the steady, warm glow of multiple stone lamps burning mammoth fat, felt not like a prison, but a sanctuary. The air was still and surprisingly mild, the thick hide coverings over the cave entrance, stitched tightly together and weighted down with bones, proving an effective barrier against the drafts that would have once stolen their warmth. The people were not just surviving the blizzard, they were using it. Lek watched the scene, a profound sense of peace settling in his chest. His son, now a robust toddler no longer plagued by the shivers, was playing at Anka's feet, swaddled in a tiny, beautifully made parka of white Arctic hare fur. Anka herself was working on a new project, something that went beyond mere necessity. She was crafting a pair of mittens, but not the simple thumbless bags they had first devised. These were shaped with a separate thumb, allowing for a dexterity that was almost like using bare hands. She was decorating the cuff with a delicate fringe of wolf fur and was carefully sewing on small, polished amber beads that caught the lamplight like frozen fire. Nearby, Gore the carver was teaching 2 younger boys. He wasn't showing them how to flake a spear point, but how to polish a needle from a sliver of bone until it was as smooth as ice, and how to drill its eye with a fine, bow-driven flint drill. "The needle is as important as the spear," Gore murmured, his voice a soft rasp. "The spear takes a life to feed us. The needle builds the life that lets us wield the spear." The boys listened, their faces serious. They were learning the philosophy of their new world. This was the true conquest. It wasn't just the ability to hunt the mammoth in the high valley. It was the ability to sit in comfort and creativity while a killing storm raged impotently outside. The security afforded by their tailored clothing had created a surplus of time and energy, and that surplus was being invested back into their culture, into their technology, into their very minds. They were not just enduring the Ice Age, they were building a civilization within it. The blizzard broke on the 6th day. The morning dawned clear and impossibly bright, the sun glaring off a world scoured clean and reshaped by the wind. The silence was absolute. Lek, Anka, and a few others pushed aside the heavy hide door and dug their way out, emerging into a transformed landscape. The snow was deep, drifted into sculpted waves that reached halfway up the pine trees. The air was so cold it felt like glass in the lungs, but inside their clothes, they were warm. They needed to check their traps and scout for game signs. Before the sowing, a trek through snow this deep would have been a grueling, life-threatening ordeal, each step a battle against the suffocating whiteness. Now, it was a journey. Anka had finished her new mittens and presented a pair to Lek. He slipped them on, flexing his fingers. The separate thumb allowed him to grip his walking staff properly. It was a small thing, but it was another leap forward, another tiny mastery over their environment. They moved through the winter woods with a quiet efficiency. Their boots kept the snow out, their trousers allowed them to high-step through the drifts, and their parkas kept their core heat locked in. They were not fighting the cold. They were moving in harmony with it, insulated from its brutality, but acutely aware of its beauty. They saw the delicate tracks of a fox, the powerful sweep of a ptarmigan's wing, the distant dark line of a reindeer herd moving across a distant ridge. They were observers now, not just victims. They were part of the ecosystem, the top predators, yes, but ones who had earned their place not just through brute strength, but through intelligence and innovation. As they returned to the cave, as the early twilight began to bleed color into the violet sky, Lek paused at the entrance. He looked back at the vast, silent, frozen world, the stars beginning to prick the heavens. He felt no fear, only a deep, resonant connection. This was their home. They had not found a way to escape its harshness. They had found a way to live within it, to understand it, and in doing so, they had become its masters. The conquest of icy Europe was not written in blood alone, but in every stitch, every seam, and every thread of sinew that had allowed the human spirit to not just endure, but to flourish in the face of the impossible.